Es gibt was aufs Ohr, eine Serienreview als Mikrofazit.
Hi, my name's Ricarda, and I'm from Seriesten.tv from Germany. And I was wondering what were the specific challenges of setting up a scene centered on a person who can't speak?
It was actually a lot of fun. I think when I first came on board the project, one of the first things that I did, my department heads, my crew, we all started taking American Sign Language classes. I am Indigenous, I am American, but I'm not deaf. So it was very important for me early on to be able to familiarize myself with that, and also I wanted to be able to communicate, even if it was at a toddler level, with Alakwa, our lead actress, who is deaf. But one of the great things that came about that is, as we were studying sign language, one of the things that I learned is that, between you and I right now talking, you're just a Zoom square on the screen. But in real life, like if we were talking to each other, like my voice, the words coming out of my mouth would be the text, right? But the way I'm delivering those words, that's the subtext. And the combination of those two things give us the full emotional intent of what's trying to be communicated. In sign language, it's slightly different, right? So when you sign, the signing that's the text, right? But the face and the emotion, that's the subtext. But you really need both this and this to get the full emotional intent of what's being communicated. And so in talking with my cinematographer and as we were developing the visual style of the show, we realized, like, actually, this has to be a close-up in our show. So for Alakwa, this you need to see this and you need to see this. And so that actually dictated our entire visual style for the show. And because this is a close-up on Alakwa, that meant that that's a close-up for everyone else as well too. So I think, to answer your question, it actually changed the entire way we shot the film. Or it actually changed the entire way we shot the series.
There is a lot of silence in the show, and I was wondering, how hard is it to keep the balance between this use of silence to obviously make us feel like the deaf person in the scene, and to add sounds to make viewers comfortable?
Yeah, no, and it all kind of stems from story, and some of our conversations were, in talking, like, the questions that we were asking internally were, can we have a scene with two deaf characters? Not one deaf character, two deaf characters, multiple deaf characters, where nothing is being said on camera. And as we sort of started shooting, as we started progressing, the answer to that question was absolutely we can. And not only that, but it can be emotional and it can be moving and you can be brought to tears in doing so. And then now to build on that idea was then looking at our action sequences and our set pieces and looking for opportunities and saying, like, where can I put myself into the shoes of Maya Lopez? Like, what would it be like for her to experience this situation that might be different for myself? And that all of that stuff sort of came out organically in the process of prepping and rehearsing. And, I learned so much in this process. And then it became this sort of like positive reinforcement cycle where I would learn, so like Alakwa would share with something that is completely mundane and ordinary to her. And I'd be like, that's amazing. I never thought of it like that. Like, we have to do that. She's like, oh, really? Okay, sure. Do it. And hopefully vice versa. But all that together was really, it was a very collaborative, organic process of how we kind of came to all those things.
The story of Maya is kind of filled with trauma. And in the beginning, I felt that this was a story of generational trauma. But after a while of watching a few of the episodes that were out so far, I rather felt that it was more of a story of generational empowerment. Don't you think? I was wondering if I was onto something there.
No, I think that's exactly what we were trying to, one of the things that we're trying to explore in the series is trauma. It isn't there is an exploration of trauma, and more specifically, how does it affect us? How does it affect those that we love? How do we cope? How do others cope? How do we cope with each other because of it? And so you have all of these unique individuals that come from their own varied backgrounds. Some of them have a shared traumatic background, some of them don't. But again, like the way Kingpin deals with trauma is different than the way Grandma Chula or Cousin Bonnie deals with trauma. But again, it was this whole series is an exploration of that, and how do we deal with it, and how do we move beyond that, and how do we cope with it?
The show's kind of a mix of genres, and I was wondering what other types of movies or TV shows did you look for in terms of inspiration?
Oh man, specific films, specific movies, specific inspiration. I think a lot of grounded, a lot of visceral, a lot of in-camera techniques were sort of like that was kind of that was kind of what we aspired to. I think films, off the top of my head, Atomic Blonde, John Wick, Mad Max Fury Road was one. We didn't have any post-apocalyptic scenes in our series, but definitely drew inspiration from that. And I think I'm trying to think what else. Just shows that did a lot of stuff in camera, films that did like, and just directors that I admire as well too. But those are the first ones that come to mind.
The show's coming out at a point of time where Marvel is kind of in a low, like there's low ratings for the latest movies and TV shows and such, but Echo is such an interesting character. So I was wondering, what would you say to those fading Marvel fans to draw them back in and give Echo a chance?
Well, it's interesting because, like, for myself, I'm incredibly excited to introduce Echo to the world. We show that she is firmly planted in the MCU, and so people that are familiar with the films and the other shows will see characters that they instantly recognize. That being said, one of the things that we tried to do was to not make it a requirement to have had seen 23 other feature films or 6 other TV shows. We wanted to invite audiences to come in fresh if they weren't familiar. And I think that's one of the great things with the character like Echo is that we get to firmly plant ourselves in the MCU, but then we get to deviate from that and go to Oklahoma, which is not really seen a lot in the MCU. I think the only other time I've ever seen it is in Logan, but again, I think that's Fox. I don't think that's MCU. But the movie Logan, they go to Oklahoma City. And I think they go to Oklahoma City. But for us, it was incredibly exciting to be able to do that.
You're certainly a very experienced director and have directed like lots of great movies so far. But I was wondering what was different when it comes to directing a Marvel project. Like, what kind of pressure do they put on you, or what kind of direction do they point you in?
Did you call me experienced? I'll take it as a compliment. I feel like a baby, but no, I think working on having the chance to work on such a variety of TV shows really sort of helps inform the process, right? So like again, like guest directing is different than pilot directing is different than feature directing, right? But one of the great things about doing different TV shows is that you get to work in like something like Grey's Anatomy or Star Trek or the Walking Dead universe. Like those are all very different worlds, but then they force for me, that forces me as a director to change the way I approach the way I approach the material visually, but it forces me to do things I wouldn't have done before. And so for the Marvel series, it was great to have all of those kind of tools in the toolbox that you picked up along the way, because then you could kind of look at a situation and say like, oh, actually, this experience can help inform that. That experience can help inform this. But I will say, as far as like working in the MCU, obviously we have a lot of resources at our disposal. We have a bigger budget. We have all this stuff. The stakes couldn't be higher. But I have to say that the creative freedom on this project was probably the greatest I've had of any project I've worked on.
ECHO is part of a movement of shows and movies about Native American characters. Like you yourself directed Reservation Dogs before. And I was wondering if you had any idea why this peak in representation is happening right now.
Why is the rise in representation happening? That's a great question. I think this is one of the things I would, this is me just speculating right now, but I think with the rise of peak TV, right, pre-strike, is that you had this sort of like gold rush for content and stories that hadn't been seen before. And so for myself and my experience in growing up, this is something that is incredibly normal to myself. I'm not used to seeing it represented on camera or on screen, but then I think with this sort of rise in peak TV, you have somebody like Taika Waititi getting to direct Thor Ragnarok. And a lot of people said, oh, who is this person? What is this, what is his story? And then you look at his filmography, you look at films like Boy, you look at films like Hunt for the Wilder People, and then it introduces audiences to an experience that they might not be familiar with, but it's Indigenous New Zealand, and that sort of gives rise to that. And then that sort of dovetails into somebody like Sterling Harjo. And I know Sterling and Taika work together closely on Reservation Dogs. And so it was interesting because there was there is an audience for these films. And I remember specifically, we all worked on I was in the writer's room on Reservation Dogs. And in the first season, once the first season of Reservation Dogs aired, executives from Hulu were coming to Sterling and they were saying like, wow, we have this spike in viewership from these random places in the United States. Montana, Oklahoma, North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, New Mexico, Arizona, Oklahoma. That's so random. And it was like, no, those aren't random. Those are all places where there are Indian reservations in the United States. And if you would, and basically what they realized is there's an entire viewership and an entire demographic that was there under the nose the whole time, but nothing was being catered to them. So once they found it, then they realized like, oh, wow, maybe we can tell more of these stories.
I was wondering with the latest few MCU shows, we got a lot of representation for formerly less represented cultures, like there was Kamala Khan for the Muslims or Moon Knight for the Egyptians, and now we have Maya representing Native American tribes. And I was wondering, with you being of Native American descent yourself, what would it have meant to you growing up to superheroes or anti-heroes in this case as a child?
Speaking for myself, and if I was a teenager and I saw a show like this, I think I would be over the moon. And when I initially met on the project and when I was talking with Kevin about it, one of the things I told him is like, listen, I grew up reading Marvel comic books and I grew up going to powwows, and those two things never overlapped, and those two things never interacted or intersected with each other. And so for this series, it was sort of like, I think my inner child was sort of screaming with joy at the prospect of bringing those two things together. And so really it was all about trying to make something that resonated with us, and felt exciting and new and fresh to us, and hopefully it'll feel that way to others.
We've already seen some iterations of Wilson Fisk on screen before, like in the Netflix show and just a few years back in the Hawkeye show. And I was wondering what kind of iteration of Fisk is this in ECHO now? Is this the one we've seen in Hawkeye, or did you draw some inspirations from a comic? And if so, what kind of Wilson Fisk are we seeing now here?
Yeah, I think the Kingpin character, he's such an interesting character, and really it all stems from the comic books, right? And that character. And one of the things that we talked about a lot behind the scenes is that Kingpin's superpower, right? It's not his physical strength, it's his intellect. And so with that in mind, we kind of like tried to lean into that and explore what that would mean for somebody in Maya Lopez's situation. And how could, a character being brought under Kingpin's wing who is in a state of vulnerability. Her father has died. She's feeling very alone in the world. How can we exploit that? What would Kingpin do in that situation? Like if it's somebody who is if it's somebody who is new and vulnerable in his sort of like underworld, what would happen in that situation? And so that really kind of dictated everything, and I think the other part of that too is again, it's like one of the great exciting things about this series is that we got to explore like, okay, how does a deaf indigenous girl from Oklahoma end up as a top lieutenant in Kingpin's army? And, and then within that, like, Kingpin isn't going to pick somebody for the sake of picking them. They have to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that they are worthy of the term successor to Kingpin. And so that was one of the big things for us to explore was how do we justify that? How do we make that real and true in our world? And again, I think that's where like Vincent comes in. Vincent is, he's got such a great understanding of the character, and those who have seen the the Netflix series are familiar with his work. And as far as I'm concerned, he is Kingpin, but he just has such a great understanding and of that character and that psychology. And really, we wanted to sort of like kind of like lean into all of that and play to those strengths.
This will be the first Marvel Disney show that allows for a little more violence. So already in the first episode, we are seeing a great fight scene. And I was wondering how you came up with those scenes, and how was it for you to direct a more violent scene in a Marvel project?
Yeah, it was interesting because again, like looking at the story, it's grounded, it's street level, it's visceral, but one of the great things about that is that we're not beholden to. It's not the fate of the universe at stake for us. Our consequences are not cosmic. Our consequences are human, and so that means that people in our show, they bleed, they get hurt, bones break, people die, and so as we started moving through the series, then it's sort of a lot of stuff kind of came organically from that. And, we wanted to push the envelope, and every time it was fun because in the post-production process, and we had the stunts and everything. And as we were exploring stuff, we got into a place where we were trying to kind of one up each other a little bit with the grittiness of things. And so the common sort of phrase was like, can we push this further? How much more can we do? But again, it has to be in service of the story. So it was actually all of that sort of stemmed from that.
Well, going back to Maya's deafness for a bit, the issue of talking about or for others rather comes up in my mind, and I was wondering, was it a deliberate choice to not give her an inner monologue, but instead just keep her dead silent?
Yeah, no, I think when I first came on the project, one of the things that we all did is that myself and my department heads, we took ASL classes, and tried to familiarize. I wanted to familiarize myself with American Sign Language and deaf culture and deaf society, and so that actually fed into a bunch of very interesting things for myself. Everything from our visual style to how we shot scenes. And one of the questions that I would ask myself is sort of like, what would this be like from Maya's perspective? What would she see? What would she experience? What would an absence of sound look like? And even within even that phrase, absence of sound, is not entirely true to the deaf experience. And so we wanted to sort of like honor and respect that, but also it gave us opportunities to put the audience in her shoes. And that was really what it was about, was try to experience something from the perspective of Maya Lopez.
How was the shooting for you, especially when it comes to like big names and important and even a little bit intimidating actors like Vincent D'Onofrio, for example?
Vincent was, he was great. And I would say, if I had to describe Vincent, is that he cares. He cares about the character. He cares about the story. And we had so many conversations in the writing phase, and we really got to sort of like kind of explore the psychology of Kingpin. He was able to bring his knowledge base with what he knew and had experienced from the Netflix show and inhabiting the character. And we're not beholden to that series, or we're not beholden to that show, but he brought that experience and was able to infuse it into our show in a really great way as well too. But I have to say, he's a method actor, so he can be very intense, but he can also be very generous. And I think one of my favorite stories from on set was, we sort of have both ends of the experience spectrum between Vincent and Alakwa. So Alakwa comes in, she's worked a few days on Hawkeye, and that's the sum total of her entire film experience, right? And so to go from that to being number one on the call sheet, to being the lead star of an entire Marvel series that's going to shoot for over 90 days, Alakwa, she came in inexperienced, but she just had that raw, innate talent and the work ethic to go along with it, that she was able to, kind of really breathe life into that character. And on the other end of the spectrum, you've got Vincent, who's got so much experience. He's worked with Stanley Kubrick. He's done like a television series for forever. And I think one of my favorite stories from on set was we were shooting a dinner scene between Maya and Kingpin, and in between takes, I think we were fixing a light or something, and then Vincent realized that every single take Maya was eating her food. And he sort of leans over in his Kingpin voice and he goes, "Maya, if you move the peas around on the plate, you don't have to eat them every time," and it was so fun. And we were sort of like working on everything in the background. And I thought that was such a generous thing for an actor to do. Like, he was sharing an actor technique with her, and you could see it was like a light bulb moment for her. It was like, oh, wow, I get it. So that was, it was a very fun environment on set.
Thank you so much for your time and have a blast. And to all the listeners, enjoy watching Echo Season 1 on Disney+.